I'm Mila. The story I'm about to tell you is not something I can easily admit, but it left me with profound thoughts about emotions, responsibility, and the thin line between right and wrong. My husband Keith had left early that morning for a weekend business trip to Los Angeles. We lived in a small house by the beach in California, with large windows that filled the space with sunlight and the soothing sound of crashing waves all day long. Keith loved his work, and I always supported him, even though his frequent trips left the house feeling emptier each time he was away. I decided to make use of the quiet morning by cleaning the house and refreshing the space. I put on my favorite jazz playlist and started in the living room. The music from the speakers whispered through the air, weaving a delicate tapestry of sound that mingled with the salty kiss of the ocean breeze, setting the stage for something unspoken yet deeply felt. I slipped into a plain white t-shirt and denim shorts, feeling the thrill of freedom as I moved with ease, unaware of the unspoken tension in the air. As I focused on dusting the high bookshelves where Keith kept some of his favorite decorations, I suddenly had the distinct feeling that someone was standing behind me. I turned around and found Lucas, Keith's son from his previous marriage, lingering in the doorway, a silent tension hanging in the air between us. Lucas emerged from his room, hair tousled and eyes heavy with remnants of dreams, a hint of vulnerability in his demeanor. "Good morning, Lucas," I said, my smile masking the flutter of emotions beneath the surface. "Morning," he replied, though his gaze lingered a little longer than usual. He stepped into the living room and sat down on the sofa, his eyes still following me. I tried not to pay too much attention and continued my work, but his presence made it harder for me to concentrate. We started making small talk about his internship plans and the projects he was working on. But when I reached up to adjust a picture frame on the top shelf, I didn't notice that I was unsteady on the small stool I was standing on. The stool wobbled slightly to one side and I lost my balance. "Mila," Lucas shouted as he rushed toward me. He wrapped his arms around my waist just in time before I could fall. In the quiet room, I felt the steadiness of Lucas's grip. We stood frozen for a few seconds, my breath caught in my chest as our eyes met, closer than ever before. I felt the firmness of Lucas's embrace, but there was also a gentleness, as if he was afraid of startling me. My heart beat faster when I realized how close we were, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath. I let out a small laugh to break the tense silence. "I'm so grateful you showed up." "I could have tumbled into danger," I remarked with a teasing smile. Lucas hesitated, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. His eyes stayed locked on me, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. His gaze held a mix of emotions, as if he wanted to say something but held back, the weight of unspoken words lingering between us. I stepped out of his hold and adjusted my t-shirt, trying to regain my composure. Lucas still stood there, his eyes not leaving me. I turned to him, my voice steady, though my heart raced with unspoken feelings. "Are you free this weekend?" Lucas shrugged, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips, as if he held a secret just out of reach. "Not really. I'll probably just stay home and relax." I nodded and walked over to the sofa, motioning for him to sit with me. I needed a minute to calm down after nearly falling. Lucas sat down too, and suddenly the space between us felt smaller than it ever had before. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was quiet, but comfortable. The sound of the waves outside drifted in, accompanied by the golden sunlight streaming through the large window. I glanced at Lucas and noticed that he was still watching me with that calm, steady gaze, but there was something different in it, something soft, something sincere. "I've always loved mornings like this," I said gently, breaking the silence, peaceful and unhurried. Lucas nodded, his voice quieter. "Me too, especially when there's someone to share it with." His words made me pause, his tone didn't sound like he was talking about something simple. I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Mila? Sometimes it feels like we understand each other without needing words," he whispered, his eyes still locked onto mine. I felt the heat rising to my face. I shouldn't feel this way, but the way Lucas looked at me made everything feel hazy. I reached out instinctively, my hand barely grazing his arm before I pulled away, unsure of what to make of the emotions stirring within me. That small touch seemed to make the air between us freeze. There was nothing but our breathing and a feeling that was impossible to put into words. "Lucas?" I whispered, filled with uncertainty, yet my gaze remained locked on them. Lucas didn't say anything. Instead, he gently placed his hand over mine, holding it as if to reassure me. In that moment, I knew. We were standing at the edge of something far bigger than just a fleeting closeness. But before I could think any further, he leaned in closer. I realized that I wasn't stepping back. Amid the morning sunlight and his warm breath, it felt as if the entire world outside had completely vanished. Lucas leaned in closer, and I couldn't stop myself from slowly leaning in as well. That moment lingered, a heartbeat suspended in time as the space between us vanished. His breath brushed softly against my cheek, warm and impossibly close. I shut my eyes, enveloped in a silence that felt almost sacred, as if the world had faded away just for us. When his lips touched mine, soft yet full of emotion, a shiver ran down my entire body. The moment lingered, heavy with the weight of a decision neither of us had spoken aloud, but both understood. My heart pounded in my chest like it wanted to break free. I knew this was wrong. I knew I shouldn't be doing this. But in that moment, my reason wasn't strong enough to resist the warmth Lucas brought. His hand slid gently across my cheek, pulling me closer as if he was afraid I might disappear. I could feel the strong and rapid beat of his heart. It matched mine completely. I reached up to touch his shoulder, feeling his firm frame and his breath quickening as he whispered my name. "Mila." The sound of his voice made me shiver. I rested my head against his chest, feeling his arms wrap securely yet tenderly around me, as if he wanted to shield me from everything outside of this world we'd created. His breath blended with mine, his warmth enveloping us in the gentle light of the room. I lightly brushed my fingers against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. Lucas tightened his arms around me just a little more, his eyes reflecting a sincerity and longing that was impossible to deny. We both knew the line had been crossed. There was no longer any defense between us. Lucas lowered his head and kissed me again, this time deeper, more passionate. His kisses made every wall I had built crumble. I ran my fingers through his hair, feeling my hands tremble under the weight of emotions I could no longer hold back. Outside, the waves continued their rhythmic song, reminding me of the world that still existed. But in that moment, all that existed for me was his breath, his heartbeat, and a closeness that felt as if we had belonged to each other for so long. I told myself to stop, but my heart wouldn't listen. I felt the warmth of his breath near my ear, his voice soft and trembling. "I don't know what to do, Mila. I can't stop thinking about you." I lightly touched his cheek, and in his gaze I saw that we were both swept away in this unspoken, overwhelming emotion. That sweet temptation had pushed us past the fragile line, leaving me with a feeling of both fear and intensity, as if I had lost myself completely in his arms. I was almost lost in the haze between reality and overwhelming emotion. The warmth of Lucas's body and the sound of his heartbeat coursing through me blurred my reason even more. His presence stirred something unfamiliar within me, a conflict I wasn't ready to face. I felt his lips move along my temple, down to my cheek, where small beads of sweat shimmered, proof of the inner turmoil within me. My whole body trembled, not out of fear, but because of a desire so real and forbidden. His fingers slid into my hair, gently brushing through it as if trying to comfort and pull me even closer. I was lost in his eyes, the eyes of someone young yet filled with yearning and sincerity that felt almost cruel in its honesty. "Mila." His voice cracked on a breath, full of longing but also pleading for me not to turn away. I didn't know what decision I made in that moment. Everything felt like I was drifting down a rushing river with no way to fight it. My heart urged me to respond, heedless of the consequences. I closed my eyes again, feeling his breath near my neck, the steady beat of his heart in his chest, making everything feel like a dream. Yet deep in my mind, a faint voice whispered, "You've crossed the line." Even so, I couldn't stop myself. For a brief second, the world felt quieter, as if we were suspended in a moment neither of us had anticipated. "I never thought this could happen," Lucas whispered, his eyes glimmering with both uncertainty and joy because I hadn't pushed him away. "But I don't want to lose you or this feeling." His words felt like arrows piercing through me. I knew I should step back, but my hand still held his. Our breaths mingled, fast yet strangely peaceful. Outside, the sound of the waves continued, an unending melody that made our moment feel even more separate from reality. I rested my head against his shoulder, feeling both safe and terrified. Reality receded behind us like a curtain being pulled shut. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or awake. The boundary had faded away like a thin layer of mist. Then, a sound broke the stillness. The front door opened, followed by a familiar voice echoing through the house. "Mila? I'm home?" I froze as if I had just woken from a long dream. Both Lucas and I jolted as though pulled out of the safe bubble we had unconsciously created. My heart felt like it stopped for a moment. Lucas quickly let go of me, his eyes wide with panic, though they still carried something deeper, something neither of us dared to speak aloud. My heart pounded so hard I thought my whole body might shake apart. The air in the room seemed to vanish as Keith walked in, his face glowing with a cheerful smile, completely oblivious to the turmoil inside me. "Mila?" His voice was warm and casual, the same way he always sounded when he returned home after a long business trip. I took a deep breath to calm myself, forcing my voice to sound steady. "I'm here," I called as I stepped out from the living room, trying to keep my smile as natural as possible, even though my hands still trembled slightly. Keith walked over, wrapping me in a hug and pressing a quick kiss to my forehead. "I missed you," he said, completely unaware of the tension that had gripped the house. I glanced over at Lucas. He was standing a few feet away in the living room, his hands stuffed into his pockets, as if to keep them from shaking. Our eyes met briefly, but it was enough for me to sense the turmoil in his heart, a mix of guilt and an unextinguished longing. "Lucas, is that you? Come over and say hi to your dad," Keith said cheerfully when he spotted him. Lucas took a long breath, steadied himself, and walked over with a forced smile. "Hey, Dad, how was your trip?" Keith beamed, patting Lucas's shoulder with pride. "It went great. Everything went smoothly. I even brought back a few gifts for you both." I felt a lump in my throat when I heard the word mom come from Keith's mouth. It reminded me that I was caught between two worlds, one filled with Keith's peaceful love and another tangled in the forbidden emotions that Lucas and I had just stepped into. Keith turned to me, his face full of happiness, as he talked about his meetings and funny stories from his trip. But his words only drifted past my ears. My mind was still trapped in that earlier moment, when I had felt truly seen and desired in a way I never thought I would experience again. Lucas stood quietly behind Keith, his eyes still drawn to me, as if trying to say something. But I avoided his gaze. I couldn't let Keith notice anything unusual. "I'll make us some coffee. You must be tired," Keith offered with a smile and headed toward the kitchen, oblivious to the heavy silence hanging in the room. As soon as the kitchen door closed behind him, I turned to Lucas. "We have to stop," I whispered, my voice shaking. Lucas took a step closer, his eyes filled with pain. "I know, but this feeling..." He swallowed hard as though struggling to find words for something even he didn't fully understand. "Lucas, we can't go on like this family. I clenched my hands together, holding on to the last bit of resolve I had. "This family is everything." Lucas was silent, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. He nodded, but I knew we both understood that what had happened between us wasn't something we could easily forget. Keith returned with 2 cups of coffee, his smile holding a warmth that felt both inviting and dangerously close to something more. "You two look so serious." "Nothing happened while I was away, did it?" I forced a laugh, light but not quite natural. "No, nothing at all. Just small talk," I replied, reaching out to take the cup of coffee from Keith. Lucas smiled too, but his eyes were still clouded with unease and regret. He turned away and walked toward the large window overlooking the sea, as if searching for a way to escape the room that was now weighed down with memories. I sat down next to Keith, but the familiar sense of happiness and peace had been shattered by a crack I wasn't sure I could ever mend. The warmth of his hand in mine couldn't quiet the storm rising inside me. In the days that followed, a silent heaviness filled the air. I tried to keep everything as normal as possible, cleaning the house, preparing dinner with Keith, asking about his work as I always did. But in every quiet moment between conversations, I could still feel Lucas's eyes on me. Lucas avoided looking directly at me when Keith was around, but whenever we crossed paths in the kitchen, the hallway, or outside on the porch, I felt the awkwardness and unspoken tension in every glance. One afternoon, when Keith went out to watch a game with friends, I stepped out to the backyard to water the rose bushes. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the leaves, but my mind was still weighed down by thoughts I couldn't let go of. I heard soft footsteps behind me and immediately knew it was Lucas. My heart tightened, but I didn't turn around. He stepped closer, standing only a few feet away. "I just wanted to step outside and get some fresh air," Lucas said, his voice low and slightly awkward. I nodded, trying to focus on what I was doing, but my fingers holding the garden hose trembled. Lucas took another step forward, close enough that I could hear the soft sound of his breathing in the cool ocean breeze. "You're avoiding me, aren't you?" His voice was quiet but filled with urgency. I stayed silent, unsure of how to respond. I was afraid that if I said anything, everything would unravel. "I know. Everything that happened. It's hard to accept." Lucas hesitated, his eyes filled with torment, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. "I can't stop thinking about you." I turned to look at him, and in his eyes I saw all the emotions I was trying to bury. Confusion, longing, and guilt tangled together. "Lucas, we have to move past this," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. His gaze faltered for a moment before returning to mine, pained yet resolute. "But I don't know how. When everything keeps replaying in my head, every glance, every moment makes me remember it all." I gripped the hose tighter until my knuckles turned white. I felt the same way. Every morning and every night, I saw that moment as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. But I knew I had to stop. This family was everything Keith and I had built together. I took a deep breath, my eyes stinging as tears threatened to spill. "Lucas, if you care about this family, about your dad, then we have to let go." He stayed silent, as though fighting a battle within himself. Finally, he nodded and turned away, his shoulders shaking slightly as if he had just lost something precious. I watched him walk back into the house, leaving me standing alone in the fading twilight, feeling empty and aching in every part of my being. I knew this was the right thing to do, but the distance between us felt like it had torn a piece of my heart away. I stood still in the yard as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the horizon. The waves kept crashing steadily, like a reminder of the patience and permanence of time. But inside me, everything was still swirling like an uncalmable storm. I knew the feeling hadn't disappeared. Every glance, every memory of Lucas was etched into my mind. But I also knew that if I didn't act, if I continued to live in this emotional limbo, everything would fall apart. That night, in the quiet house while Keith was sound asleep, I sat on the couch staring out the large window. The vast night ocean stretched before me, but my thoughts were tangled and restless. The next morning, I decided it was time to end the suffocating tension once and for all. I walked into the kitchen where Lucas was sitting, his eyes immediately lifted when he saw me. Perhaps he already knew that this conversation was inevitable. I sat across from him, my hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. "Lucas," I began, my voice soft but firm. "We can't keep doing this." Lucas nodded slowly, but his eyes held a deep sadness. "I know. But how do we pretend it never happened?" I looked at him for a long time, the ache in my chest mixing with a sense of resolve. "We can't change what happened, but we can choose how to move forward. You have your whole future ahead of you, and I have a responsibility to this family." Lucas lowered his head, his shoulders heavy. "I've never felt anything this strong before, but I'll try." I reached out and gently touched his hand one last time, a silent farewell. "I believe you can, and I will too." We sat together in silence, but this time it was a silence of acceptance. I knew that what we had wasn't a mistake. It was a part of the complex emotions that humans sometimes can't control. But choosing to let go didn't diminish its value. Instead, it was a testament to the growth and respect we had for each other and for this family. A week later, Lucas received an offer from a major company in New York, a dream internship he had always hoped for. When he shared the news over dinner, Keith was overjoyed and hugged him, speaking proudly of his son's success. I smiled, though inside I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The day Lucas left, I stood at the door and gave him a long hug. "Take care of yourself, Lucas," I whispered. He nodded, his eyes gentle but determined. "You too, Mila." He walked away, carrying with him all his dreams and memories. I stood there, watching his car disappear down the coastal road, feeling lighter yet empty, as though I had closed an entire chapter of my life. Our story didn't have a conventional happy ending, but sometimes choosing to walk away is the only way to hold on to what is beautiful. I stepped back into the warmth of our home, hearing Keith call to me from the living room, his voice familiar and comforting. I walked in and smiled at him. Life moved on, and I had chosen to carry on with the peace I knew I needed to protect within myself.